Hello everybody, Ash here, and today, sadly, we're not gonna be the most positive. Today, at least here in the channel, we're gonna be just a little negative because I have a few criticisms about what is otherwise a phenomenal, acclaimed game that's just recently come out, and that, of course, is Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. I'm sure this will be nominated, if not winner, for Game of the Year in pretty much every outlet out there, including Jeff Keighley's Game of the Year. We'll have to wait and see. It is a phenomenal game, but I kinda wanted to talk about something that's been bothering me with it. I still haven't finished the game. This is not a review. This is not a critique-based complaint. These are just my general feelings about a certain aspect of a game I'm gonna talk about in a bit as I'm playing through it. That's kind of been making me a little unmotivated when it comes to actually finishing it. So let's get to it so we can get the proper context for this. Let's remember Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild, of course, was the prequel to the recent release Tears of the Kingdom, and it was pretty much a revolution when it came to not only Zelda titles, but video games in general. It pretty much redefined what an open world game is supposed to be, with its complex physics and chemistry systems, as well as its generalized freedom, allowing the player to do pretty much whatever they freaking want, whenever they want, and they can do the final boss right from the start of the game as soon as you finish the tutorial. So yeah, it was an amazing game. It's probably one of my favorite games of all time. I own a poster of it right there. It's not in the place it's supposed to be, but it's been hanging out there for a while now because it fell from my wall. Anyway, neither here or there. It's an amazing game, and of course, we would eventually get a sequel for it, right? Yep, we actually did. No ironic cutaway this time. We genuinely got a sequel. And it was announced in 2019 at E3. It was the closing announcement, and it was insanely hype. I remember that day as if it were today. It's already been so many years, actually. This game took forever to come out, and we barely got any info on it as it was leading up to release, so that was fun. But it was announced, and when that happened, we saw a really intriguing trailer. You see, even though Breath of the Wild was a phenomenal game in many aspects, one thing it kind of failed at was its storytelling. And while story isn't necessarily the number one thing I'm playing Zelda for, it really depends on the game. Ever since arguably Ocarina of Time, maybe Link's Awakening, Zelda really decided to tell some cool stories. And they've been working on that pretty much ever since they made the leap to 3D. From Ocarina of Time all the way to Skyward Sword, you can really see how they started to focus more and more on that linear progression and trying to build character and lore in a way that feels meaningful. But Breath of the Wild really didn't try to do that. And in that case, I believe it was pretty much fine. Since Breath of the Wild was pretty much focused on freedom and exploring the world and doing whatever you want whenever you want, I don't really think that game needed a story to stand out. It was kind of doing its own thing. Not to say it didn't have a story at all, it did pretty much all it could, considering the limitations it had. But it had a lot of limitations. It really wasn't ambitious in terms of storytelling. You were not playing Breath of the Wild for the story. You were playing Breath of the Wild so you can explore the world and have some fun adventures that you will never forget. But then we got a sequel announcement, right? And when Tears of the Kingdom was announced, back then it didn't even have a name, we saw that cool dark cutscene where we saw the corpse of Ganondorf, a recurring villain from the series that was absent from Breath of the Wild and apparently was coming back. And that was so exciting. And that was all we got for a long time. And during that pre-release period, we got just those little breadcrumbs of information, including some interviews, such as this one that came out around the time the first trailer released, where Eiji Aonuma, series director, stated that this game was gonna have a story that would be even darker than arguably the darkest game in the series, that being Zelda Majora's Mask. And since the trailer really did look intriguing and dark and cool, we kinda accepted that as fact. And from there, our excitement would build and build, and we were expecting this game to, even though it was confirmed to use the same map as the original, to build an entirely new story that itself would be enough to justify the existence of the sequel. Recently, we got some more info, we got a new trailer, we got another new trailer, and now the game's out. And it's pretty great because it really built upon the freedom and the mechanics that Breath of the Wild offered, make it so that original game is almost a little obsolete by now. There's almost no reason to play Breath of the Wild if you just want to hang out and explore if you have Tears of the Kingdom. Of course, there are some reasons, but Tears of the Kingdom is so much better in pretty much every way. I'm sure if I open up the old game, I'm gonna start missing its mechanics from the moment I hold the controller. So yeah, it's a phenomenal game, and it's really, really fun to explore. I remember when the reviews were coming out a little before release, we started seeing praise left and right, from the new mechanics to the apparently improved stories and the return of traditional Zelda dungeons, because that's also a thing Breath of the Wild kind of messed up on. It had the Divine Beasts, which were all very samey, and again didn't really have a lot of story relevance, so people really didn't care for them. They were also very simple when it came to puzzles, and one thing people were hoping would be improved in Tears of the Kingdom would be the inclusion of traditional Zelda dungeons. And at first it seemed like that was the case, from the reviews I was seeing anyway, and what people were talking about. Temples are back, different style dungeons are back, and that seemed really nice. So when I first picked up the game and I cleared the tutorial area, I was so excited to play it that I played it for like 2 weeks straight at all the free time I had, pretty much. I was addicted. Again, this is a great fun game to just hang out and explore in, do all the side quests, see all the different things you can see in the world, all the fun changes and all the new additions. It's just like the original, but better. And that's not really a bad thing at all, even if it is a bit similar. But the thing that was sort of staying in the back of my mind while I was pretty much focusing on exploring the game and doing the shrines and finding the towers was the main story. It initially was very engaging, and as I started going through the memories, which are back from the original game, I was more and more curious, more and more engaged. But at the same time, right after I cleared the tutorials, the game just did the same thing the original did, where they tell you to go to 4 different regions in the map, the same 4 regions from the original game, and do whatever, dungeons. We're all sure it was dungeons, so didn't even have to go there. We all knew there's gonna be 1 dungeon for each one of these areas, and yeah, the whole spiel. That wasn't exactly a surprise. What was a surprise to me, though, is how disappointing they were. Because all evidence was pointing to this game being a more story-driven version of what Breath of the Wild was. It was one of the biggest issues with that game, and pretty much everyone agreed with it. That the story was very surface level, and the dungeons were all very simple, and while the exploration was really great, they really needed to improve on that campaign for the sequel to make it feel worth it. And while they made it feel worth it in other ways, I'm seriously disappointed by what I'm seeing of the main story. So when I picked up the game, I did pretty much all the towers, I've done most of the memories by now. They're decently cool, they're interesting, and I started doing the dungeons as I went. I didn't make a conscious decision to do all the towers first. I was just sort of exploring and going to different places and looking for certain pieces of armor or weaponry that I really wanted to get. And when I realized I had done all the towers already and I only had done one of the dungeons. That first dungeon, which to me was the Rito dungeon, was a little basic, but I assumed it was just because it was the one the game made you go to first. I mean, there's no direct order to do all the dungeons, but the story seemed like it really wanted you to do the Rito one first, so I went there first. And it was a little reminiscent of the Divine Beast from Breath of the Wild. You had to go to these different areas to unlock the boss door, and the map was unlocked from the start, And you get help from now, instead of one of the champions, you get one of the descendants of the sages, which is effectively the same thing. So what I was seeing was pretty interesting. We even get a little bit of an exposition cutscene after the dungeon was done, where they explain more about the lore. And when I saw that, I assumed, oh, so they're doing different cutscenes about the main mystery plot as you're going through the story. What I assumed was happening was something similar to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, where in that game you can do stuff in whatever order you want, but whenever there's something important that's supposed to happen in each one of that game's stories, it plays out much the same no matter where you were or what boss you decided to beat first. So for example, in that game you're always gonna battle the first Titan Pokemon, and Arven's gonna treat it like the first. And then you do the second, and the thing that's supposed to happen after you beat your second Titan happens no matter which one you do, no matter in which order. And what I assumed was happening was pretty much the same thing. They did different versions of each cutscene to match each of the areas you're in, to do it in whatever order you wanted. I seriously thought they were going to do a more linear, focused story. But then I started the second dungeon. And I realized, and by that point I had already done all the towers, as I said, I realized it was much the same. I got to the dungeon, and not only was the setup very similar, where you were hearing a voice that was sure was going to be one of the original sages, which guess what? I was right. But also, you got to go to these different terminals again, a la the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild, and the dungeons themselves are very reminiscent of the Divine Beasts in terms of design. They don't have that cool, sort of more linear, while still explorational designs of the older 3D Zelda dungeons. In those games, you first had to get a map, and usually there would be an item in each dungeon that would allow you to progress as you went through it. That's the typical Zelda formula for dungeons, something that Breath of the Wild scrapped. And at first, because the Rito skill is very much movement focused, I assumed those skills that you get in each of the dungeons, because you get a different skill at each dungeon, were going to be the substitute for items. But I soon realized pretty much every other one is just a combat skill a la the champion's abilities from Breath of the Wild. You just happen to get them before you finish the dungeon instead of after. So yeah, these dungeons are designed sort of non-linearly, and unlike the dungeons in, say, Twilight Princess, where you had that whole dungeon where you went into that mansion where there were those monster guys that at first seemed nice, but then there's a jump scare, I'm sure you know the one. And then there are also dungeons like Dragon Roost Cavern in Wind Waker, where it pretty much felt like a whole story. You had a setup for it, and then you went through it, and it was sort of linear, but you were also sort of meant to explore. Then you eventually found the item, you found the map, and you ran through characters that were initially in the pre-dungeon story setup for it as you went through it. And then there's one point where you go outside the mountain and you get to see the outside, but then you go back in and there's also those scorching hot areas near the lava. That dungeon specifically is a good example of how Zelda dungeons can be very varied and they can almost feel like a story. I've never been that much of a dungeon guy when it comes to Zelda. I'm not the best at using my brain for puzzles, and usually Zelda dungeons just kind of give me a headache. With that in mind, so I wouldn't feel lost, I would usually do Zelda dungeons in one go, even though they usually take like 30 to 60 to even more minutes than that. They usually felt like almost sort of a movie. They were a little bit linear, but you're still focused on exploring and finding the different keys to progress, but then you're at different points rewarded with character interactions and different set pieces across the dungeon that make it feel like one whole story. You usually face a mid-boss somewhere partway through the dungeon, and when you're done, you might be a little tired, your head might hurt a bit, but you are satisfied. And that's not the feel I get from the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom. They feel, again, much like the Divine Beast. You just kind of go to the different points at more or less whatever order you want, and then once you're done, you go to the boss and you beat it, and the dialogue in between is just very formulaic. Oh, there are only 3 terminals left, Link! There's no interesting character interactions, there are no set pieces, And while the puzzles are somewhat interesting, they feel somewhat reminiscent of the shrines you already have in this game, which explore the physics and the skills Link obtains early in this game just as well as the dungeons do. Maybe they should have really brought back items again, traditional Zelda items, or some actual substitute to it that helps you solve puzzles. Not just a combat skill or a movement skill that doesn't feel substantial enough and isn't very well used in puzzles. On top of that, I really feel like they should have done a more linear story. Because when I finished the Gerudo dungeon, which was my second dungeon, and I found out that you got the exact same exposition cutscene, almost word for word, after every single dungeon in this game, I didn't even know what to say. Honestly, this game is amazing and it's polished to near perfection, or at least that's what I thought. Because this doesn't feel polished. What were they thinking? No, genuinely, I don't want to sound too negative, too critical here, but that just doesn't seem, it seems like there's something missing. Genuinely, did they really think it was alright to do this long-ass exposition cutscene 4 times through the entire game? Like, did they not think about it? Did they think it was okay? Like, you really seeing the same thing like 4 times and just sort of meant to wait? I mean, it's not that bad, but it's still jarring. It's still something you have to compromise for. Like, you have to remember, oh, someone's doing this dungeon first. So of course, they're gonna play the same cutscene in all the dungeons so everyone is up to speed. Great! Instead of building on the story and building on the mysteries, because there are some mysteries that we're not aware of. There's still things, even after seeing pretty much all the memories, there's still some questions I don't know the answer for. And they're probably just gonna be answered in the finale. I still don't know! They could have built on that as we went through the story. There are many techniques they could have used to do that, including just doing a more linear story. You can keep the open world, you can keep the spread objectives for other sorts of missions, side quests, other main quest objectives, but why did they feel the need to do all 4 dungeons separate again? I feel like at this point they're just hurting the story, because they have to build everything around the idea that the player can do all of these in any order you want. So the player has to be up to speed with the story, so they all have to be pretty much equal and effectively the same. They're so repetitive in their story structure, they're so repetitive in how they're designed, and they kind of just feel the same. And that pretty much took away all of my motivation to finish the game, for at least currently. As I said, I was addicted to the game in the first 2 weeks of playing. But then I got to the Gerudo dungeon, and when I realized it was pretty much the same as the other ones, I just kind of got bored. I realized I did all the towers already. I did pretty much all the memories. I had genuinely no desire to keep going. I will eventually do the shrines after all of this. I will do all of them, sure. That's a long-term process. My short-term objective was finishing the main story, since I had already done all the towers and a lot of the shrines. But when I realized doing all the stories was going to be so repetitive and so unengaging, I wasn't even mad. I wasn't even calling the game bad. I was just genuinely unmotivated. This game that's supposed to be the best game ever made, best game of the year, whatever else people are saying, the story is, I'm sorry to say, the story is just kind of mid. The main story is just kind of mid. I'm just kind of unmotivated. I just finished the Gerudo dungeon right before doing this video, so I left the game hanging for like 2 weeks. I started playing other stuff. I picked up Sonic Unleashed again. I started playing some other games I really like. And then I kind of forgot it and I didn't really want to go back. I was genuinely feeling so unmotivated to keep playing because the dungeons were so repetitive and boring. What was the reason? I wasn't particularly engaged in the story anymore. I knew it would take so long for any payoff to happen. Why would I need to keep going? What was the point? Well, I still don't know, and that's why I'm making this video. I'm still gonna finish the game. It's still an amazing game, but this is a jarring, obvious issue that not many people are talking about. And on top of that, I'm even inclined to say that Breath of the Wild did it better. Because while Breath of the Wild was very simple also, and the dungeons in that game were more visually repetitive than the ones in Tears of the Kingdom, since they were all the Divine Beasts and they were all very samey, at least that game had very original ideas. Tears of the Kingdom promised us the return of Ganondorf. that original trailer. Aonuma said it was gonna be the darkest story in the series, darker than even Majora's Mask, but what we got is basically a refresh of Ocarina of Time. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I kind of already accepted that the Breath of the Wild continuity, so to speak, is effectively a reboot to the rest of the series, and everything that's gonna connect to the older games is pretty much just an Easter egg or a fun little callback. I think it's better if we all accept that too. It's clear the developers don't want to feel restrained by the timeline and they want to do something new. So effectively, Breath of the Wild and especially Tears of the Kingdom is just kind of a reboot with a few fun callbacks. It's a reboot without the commitment to actually rebooting the series. And that's initially fine. If they can take an older story and do it in a more interesting or different way, then sure. But they're literally just doing Ocarina of Time again, but worse in terms of story. They brought back sages, they brought back the temples, now they're slightly different, but they're still the same idea. Ganondorf is returning, and he has pretty much the same backstory from Ocarina of Time. It's not even the same Ganondorf, it's probably a different incarnation of Ganondorf, assuming they still care about that concept at all. They're talking about the founding of Hyrule, and I kinda have to assume this is referring specifically to this version of Hyrule because we kind of know how Hyrule was founded and refounded multiple times through the timeline. So yeah, this is a reboot, which theoretically should be fine. But if you're just gonna do the same story again, you're doing Imprisoning War, you're doing sages, you're doing temples, you're doing Rauru, you're doing pretty much everything you did in Ocarina of Time, but slightly different and not as in-depth and not as focused because they're still bound by doing every single dungeon in a way that's equal to each other. And also doing them in a way that's kind of weak, if you ask me. And now I'm trying to force myself to get back into the game, because it is a fun game to mess around with. It's frankly a phenomenal game. It's a technical achievement unlike any other when it comes to programming, when it comes to open world design. It is a phenomenal game. I'm not trying to take that away from it. But I'm just trying to point out something people don't seem to be talking about. That's the fact that the story is not really that much better than Breath of the Wild, if better at all, because at least that one was a little more creative, while this one is just pretty much a different take on Ocarina of Time. So that's where I stand. I just finished my second dungeon. Hopefully, I'll do the other two soon enough so I can get to the finale and possibly see some cool, new, interesting stuff the story might be trying to do, and also just explore and do more fun stuff in this world, because the side quests and the other events you get to see and experience in this game are great. This game is great. It's a 9.999 out of 10. But this one single issue, it's pretty much taking away all my motivation to keep playing. And I just genuinely want to play something else. Between doing these basic, repetitive dungeons and just playing a more active, focused game, like an action game or something, I seriously kind of want to play the action game more. And this shouldn't happen. This is the new Zelda game. It's supposed to be exciting, it's supposed to be engaging, and I'm not that engaged, and that's making me weirdly, unconditionally sad. I don't like to make these kinds of videos where the subject is kind of negative, and I'm really talking about how I'm just really disappointed, but facts are facts. I am kind of disappointed, and my hope is that in a possible new Zelda game, they take the best aspects from each style of Zelda game and build an ultimate sort of Zelda experience where you can have a more focused story with good characters, but also an open world that you get to explore and see all these fun different things in, just like Breath of the Wild. I think they should really dial down this whole thing with allowing player freedom for the sake of doing a better story. It was cool in Breath of the Wild because, ooh, this game is so open, right? That was a really cool innovation, but now that you're trying to do something else, trying to do a sequel, you're trying to build on it, why not do a linear story? Do different dungeons, but make it so you can only access them one at a time. You can still explore the whole world, you can still maybe walk around those dungeons, but not enter it, not do the story cutscenes. That means you can do a more focused story that builds on itself a little more. I would honestly take that. And you could do maybe a compromise, a way to do an ultimate Zelda experience. Because I've seen a lot of fans that are also just kind of disappointed that we're not gonna see Ocarina of Time style 3D Zelda games no more. This seems to be the new direction, and I hope they build on it in a way that we get to satisfy all of these fans because I can see the vision. It's pretty much there. Your chance is right there, Nintendo. Just do it. I believe in you. You guys are amazing. Goodbye, everyone.